Do you know what HIPAA is?
What is HIPAA?
I don't even know. I don't know. What?
You might have heard the word HIPAA in the context of medical data privacy. You've probably signed a HIPAA form at your doctor's office and been told that HIPAA will protect you.
Most people think that HIPAA means that their medical information, their medical records are kept private.
Right, HIPAA. It's starting to ring a bell, the HIPAA privacy rule. But what if I told you that HIPAA doesn't protect your privacy at all, and your medical data is being shared all over the place with millions of entities, and this is explicitly permitted by the law itself?
A lot of people think that HIPAA actually protects their medical information. It doesn't.
Oh boy. So this is our first video in a series exploring medical privacy, and it's a doozy. First of all, it's really difficult to get any transparency into the data sharing that goes on in the medical world. But I chatted with 3 people who have managed to get a peek behind the surgical curtain of the behemoth health data industry. There's Twyla Brace, a nurse and president of a non-profit that fights for medical privacy; Rob Frommer, senior attorney with a pro bono law firm that is currently fighting the state of New Jersey for unlawful infant medical data collection; and Keith Smith, co-founder of the Surgery Center of Oklahoma and a practicing anesthesiologist. What I learned from them and from diving deep into this rabbit hole really blew my mind. Essentially, the state of medical privacy is a mess. Throughout this series, we explore electronic health records, their vulnerabilities to hacking, and how they share our sensitive health data with government entities and all kinds of other third parties. We uncover how medical practitioners are financially incentivized to collect excess information from you to feed this data machine. We talk about the warehouses of baby DNA being collected at birth in almost all states in the USA without parent consent. No, this isn't a conspiracy theory. There have already been lawsuits against Texas, Minnesota, Michigan, and New Jersey for this practice. And in this video, we'll focus on HIPAA, understanding what HIPAA actually is and how it came to allow our data to be shared without us even knowing. We'll specifically look at how we've been tricked into thinking we have privacy and steps we can take to reclaim control of our medical data. Let's begin by understanding the history of how HIPAA came to be.
HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996.
It offers opportunity by allowing people to take their health insurance from job to job.
A lot of people don't realize that HIPAA was originally created to make it easier to share medical information for the purpose of insurance. It set the stage for the eventual digitization of health records, creating standards for the sharing of that electronic data and expanding who is allowed to get access to information without needing patient consent.
HIPAA is a permissive data sharing rule.
We can learn more about the goals of HIPAA by looking at those who were pushing for it. We'll dive into entities who stood to benefit financially from the digitization and standardization of medical data sharing in the next video. But in this video, I want to focus on the government organization that played a huge role in shaping and advocating for HIPAA. HHS, or the Department of Health and Human Services. You might not have heard of HHS, but it's one of the largest federal agencies, and you've almost surely heard of a bunch of the agencies that fall under their purview. For example, CDC, or Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, FDA, or Food and Drug Administration, and NIH, or National Institutes of Health, all fall under the HHS. They're also responsible for overseeing Medicare and Medicaid. Given the extensive responsibilities of HHS, the agency had strong incentives to make it easier to collect medical data, to streamline programs, combat waste, and leverage patient information for research and analytics. Before HIPAA, the government's ability to access medical data was more limited and fragmented due to varying state privacy laws. HIPAA would solve this, unlocking medical data that had previously been out of their grasp. But the reason it had previously been more difficult to share medical data was that this information is highly sensitive and personal, and being able to keep it private has long been a cultural expectation. On top of that, It's not meant to be easy for the government to obtain your private information. Checks and balances are essential to protect against abuse of centralized power. Given that HIPAA would largely undermine patient-doctor confidentiality by broadening permissions for data sharing with third parties, it was met with concern and a recognition that it had to be counterbalanced with some privacy protections. So HIPAA included a provision that said Congress had 3 years to pass comprehensive privacy legislation. And if Congress wasn't able to come to an agreement about the language of this privacy legislation in this time, there was a backup plan.
The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services was required to write a rule if Congress did not pass a privacy law.
Basically, if Congress couldn't come to a bipartisan consensus on this privacy law within 3 years, then HHS were given the authority to create their own privacy standards. Let me repeat that part. HHS, the federal agency that wanted to collect people's medical data, was put in charge of writing the law that would also protect people's medical data from collection. Isn't that a bit like asking the fox to write the rules for protecting the henhouse? We get a sense of HHS's priorities by looking at their recommendations to Congress during this 3-year period. The priority was not privacy.
They actually talked about the age-old right of privacy. But then they said that we needed to move away from that to use data for publicly useful purposes.
i.e., individuals must sacrifice their privacy for what they called the common good. Instead of letting patients decide whether their data is shared, HHS recommended doing away with written patient consent and replacing it with laws that would allow certain entities to share their information automatically without needing patient approval. Now, the deadline for passing privacy legislation eventually expired, and predictably, Congress was unable to agree to a privacy law in that time.
So after 3 years, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services wrote the rule.
The regulation created by HHS, known as the HIPAA privacy rule, went into effect in 2003, and it did include some restrictions to who could access medical data under these new permissive laws.
Your doctor giving your boss your health records without your permission? That's a HIPAA violation.
What it protects from is like your medical information being given to like your employer. You know, the idea that I might go to see a shrink, I don't want my employer to know about it.
Indeed, the most restrictive part of HIPAA is actually the part that consumers themselves come into contact with, which might explain why people think HIPAA improved their medical privacy. I'm sure many of us have had experiences where we've tried to get access to the medical records of a family member only to be told that the hospital can't hand them over because it would be a HIPAA violation. But the reality is that although this rule seems to restrict sharing at the consumer level, when you pull back the curtain of this privacy theater, it's a very different story.
So HHS, when they wrote their rule, they just decimated privacy rights. They gave the data away to all of these other entities.
So who exactly is allowed to get your information? Well, first, those who are directly involved with your treatment are naturally going to have access to your data.
The clinic, the hospital, the laboratory, the radiology facility, the nursing home.
And then the privacy rule goes on to explain under which circumstances these entities are allowed to share your protected health information and with whom. Some of these are what you'd expect for treatment and payment, etc. But one of the permitted uses is for something called healthcare operations.
The definition of healthcare operations for which your data can be shared is almost 400 words long.
Let's read it. Healthcare operations means any of the following activities of the covered entity
It's essentially a list of about 65 non-clinical business activities. So nothing having to do with your medical treatment whatsoever. If your hospital, if your clinic, if your lab chooses to share your identifiable medical information, they can.
To be clear, these 65 non-clinical business activities permit PHI or protected health information to be shared, meaning medical information still attached attached to identifiers like your name and social security number. And most importantly,
they're allowed to share the data without patient consent.
And you won't even know they're doing it. One of the most criticized aspects of the federal health privacy rule, as one Yale journal notes, is its lax restrictions on the use and disclosure of health information for marketing activities. HIPAA allows a provider to use a patient's health information for marketing activities without obtaining the patient's informed consent. In 2010, there was a modification to the HIPAA privacy, security and enforcement rules, which came after the HITECH Act was passed. These rules expanded the scope of HIPAA and broadened the definition of business associates to include all kinds of contractors and subcontractors for healthcare providers and insurers. Under this rule, there are now 1.5 million entities that are considered business associates. And when you combine that with all the other entities that your personally identifiable medical records are now allowed to be shared with without your consent?
The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services said that there were 2.2 million entities that are under the rule, which means those 2.2 million entities have access to your medical records if those who hold them choose to share them.
And whether information ultimately does get shared with these 2.2 million entities is officially left up to the ethics and best judgments of those who hold your data. How do you find out if your data has been shared? You basically can't. Under HIPAA, organizations are not required to provide an accounting of how private health information has been disclosed if it falls into any of these categories, such as healthcare operations that we just spoke about. But your data can also be shared in something called a limited data set, or LDS, and no accounting of this is required either. What exactly is a limited data set? It's a set of health data that excludes 16 identifiers like name, social security number, etc. But it still includes things like date of birth, zip code, and admission dates. So don't let the label limited fool you. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services freely admits that re-identification of this data is possible, and that LDS are considered identifiable, even without the specific direct identifiers. All that stops someone re-identifying this data is a promise not to. Johns Hopkins defines LDS as a limited set of identifiable patient information. And unlike PHI, that can only be shared with a mere 2.2 million entities, limited data sets can be shared with anyone, as long as it's for the purpose of the very broad categories of research, healthcare operations, and public health. And again, this is done without patient consent or knowledge, and no one is required to provide an accounting of this sharing. We are suffering under an illusion of medical privacy. It is very complicated for organizations to comply with all of the ins and outs of HIPAA regulations, and so many people think that the regulation itself is restrictive when it comes to medical data sharing. As the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology said, it's a common misconception that HIPAA makes it difficult, if not impossible, to move electronic health data when and where it is needed for patient care and health. But this burdensome and bureaucratic theatre hides the reality of the situation, that HIPAA instead actually improves the flow of health information, and that there are millions of entities who can get our medical data, zero transparency into where this data ends up, and no ability for consumers to hold institutions accountable if it falls into the wrong hands. And on top of that, the whole system is held together by promises and best judgments.
HIPAA is not about protecting anyone's privacy. HIPAA is about making very clear the extent to which your privacy is going to be violated and who gets to violate it.
The most pernicious part about this illusion of privacy is that it means no one feels the need to push back against the status quo. Even congressional staffers don't understand the extent of data sharing that current laws actually permit.
These are the people advising members of Congress about what's what in healthcare, and they have no idea that HIPAA does not protect their privacy. We talked to 22 different congressional offices, and at every office we asked the health policy staff, what does it mean when you sign that HIPAA form at the clinic? They said, it means that my information is between me and my doctor.
Many healthcare professionals themselves misunderstand HIPAA.
If there were 10 physicians sitting here and I made the statement I just made, they would all think I was crazy. What's really scary is none of them would even go check it out.
People also don't understand that the government too can access their information.
People think that HIPAA protects their privacy as against the government, but it does nothing of the sort. It explicitly allows government to have a blank check to your medical records.
We chatted to two people working the front desk at a clinic, and one of them told us they had no idea what HIPAA was, and the other said that it's to protect privacy.
The information gathered by HIPAA, do you know where else it can be shared with? Can it go to other entities?
Unless you give permission to the other entities, no.
They think they have privacy and they have none whatsoever, unless they are in a state that has a privacy law that protects them from HIPAA.
So that leads us into what we can do. One thing that can fix this situation is if states adopt stronger privacy laws than HIPAA, in which case the state law stands. Before HIPAA, states did have their own medical privacy laws, but when HIPAA came along, many states conformed their privacy law to HIPAA, eliminating their state privacy protections. For example, before HIPAA, Hawaii had some of the strongest medical privacy laws in the country. When the federal privacy rule was issued, Hawaii repealed their own privacy statute, saying that there was little support for a state law, given the adoption of the federal rule. Or let's look at how Arizona adjusted their privacy laws. It looks good at first glance, all medical records are privileged and confidential, but notice the clause at the start, unless otherwise provided by law. So they've permitted their state protections to be wiped away by HIPAA. There are some states that do still have stronger laws than HIPAA. In Minnesota, for example, there are 8 kinds of disclosures that HIPAA would otherwise permit, but Minnesota requires patient consent. Having stronger state laws for medical privacy helps close up the loopholes that HIPAA permits. So one thing that we can do is encourage our state reps to pass better medical privacy laws that put consent of data sharing back into the hands of the patient. Twyla's nonprofit has a page on their website with examples of good privacy laws that might be considered. We can also spread awareness that HIPAA doesn't protect medical privacy. Twyla's website also has HIPAA fact sheets that you can print off and share with others. Another important step to changing the status quo is staying informed ourselves when we visit the doctor.
When you're in the waiting room and they give you sheets of paper to sign, well, you should actually read those sheets of paper and you should make decisions about what's on them.
Sometimes they don't even show you what you're signing.
They just give you one of those little etch-a-sketches. It's about this big and it's just, they'll say, sign there. So I'm encouraging all of your viewers to ask for the paper copy.
One of the forms you'll be given is a Notice of Privacy Practices. HIPAA requires this form to be given to you, and it basically explains how your medical information is allowed to be used and shared. This isn't actually a consent form. It's simply an acknowledgement that you've been informed of your rights and the provider's privacy practices. The law requires your healthcare provider to ask you that you received the notice, but it turns out that the law doesn't require you to sign the notice.
They want you to sign it. By law, you do not have to sign it, and we encourage everybody not to sign it.
Now, refusing to sign doesn't actually protect your privacy. Your consent is not required for your data to be shared. Given that, what would your refusal achieve? Well, for one, it can serve as a form of documentation. If you later file a complaint about how your data was handled, your refusal to sign could show that you did not acknowledge being informed about how your data could be used. This might give you a stronger position when questioning the clinic's practices, as they can't claim that you were fully aware of these practices. Indeed, many might argue that we're never really made aware of how all kinds of businesses use our data, and the vague privacy notices we receive are crafted more to protect the business than actually inform the consumer. Not signing is also a kind of protest against such practices, but to be honest, most of those working at clinics aren't even aware themselves of how data is shared. They're probably not the ones you should be protesting to, and be warned that refusing to sign will likely create uncomfortable conflict at the clinic.
You run the risk of the receptionist telling you that, when Dr. X can't see you then.
Legally, clinics aren't allowed to refuse you treatment if you don't sign their privacy practices form, but unfortunately most clinics don't actually know this and will likely deny you service anyway. Your number one priority should be to look after your health, so do what you need to do in order to get treatment. But here are some ways that you can still stand up for your rights, even if you sign the form, ranging from least confrontational to most confrontational. You You can simply sign the form and then afterwards file a HIPAA violation complaint with the HHS Office of Civil Rights. You can sign the form but take a moment to educate the clinic in a polite way about what the law says around these forms. Twyla offers this card that you can keep in your wallet that explains your rights, which can be helpful for spreading awareness in such a situation. I'd encourage you to use this as an educational opportunity instead of a confrontational one. You can ask for a printed copy of the privacy policy to make sure that you've read it in full. Then
sign it and write the words "under duress." Take a picture of the form.
Or you can choose a clinic that has opted out of all this data sharing, where they respect your rights, and there's a list of them that can be found at jointhewedge.com. Interestingly, the HHS website used to notify people that it was their right to not sign this Notice of Privacy Practices form, but that disappeared from the website in 2017. If you clicked on the Understanding the HIPAA Notice PDF link in the past 7 years, you'd land on page not found, a broken link for 7 years. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Notice of Privacy Practices form is not the same as a consent form. A consent form will usually have things like, you agreed to be billed a certain amount, and you agree to this procedure. Your clinic will likely require you to sign that form in order to be treated.
A really good consent form will have a yes and no on every little thing, and then you can sign it.
But a sneaky thing they do is sometimes combine this consent form with the Notice of Privacy Practices form, with only one signature for both.
It's often what we call a coercive consent form. And that coercive consent form will have treatment at the top. It'll probably have consent to be billed as the second or third item. And then it will have a cast and a crew of other kind of consents, but it will have a single solitary signature at the bottom. What you should do is cross out everything that you do not agree with and that you do not consent to. If they say, well, you cannot change anything on that form or we will not treat you, then what you should do is sign it because you need that care that day.
And then you can take one of the steps we suggested before.
Let us not just bow to these coercive consents.
Again, you should always prioritize your health. We can find ways to change the status quo without putting ourselves in danger. It is sad that we're at a stage where we have to be on the defensive when getting medical treatment, though.
You shouldn't have to come, armed for bear to the exam room, but today you kind of do.
When we visit a doctor, we're at our most vulnerable, and people shouldn't have to be on guard against overreaching data collection or coercive forms.
You don't exploit people when they're in need of care. You take care of them.
But unfortunately, some bad laws and practices have meant that we do have to start looking out for ourselves, at least until we can get better protections in place. So to summarize, HIPAA was never about bolstering privacy. It eliminated many pre-existing state laws that protected privacy and opened the floodgates for sharing patient data without needing consent. We deserve privacy in our medical system. Our health information is sensitive and we should be allowed to protect it. But instead of a privacy law, we have stripped patients of their right to choose for themselves whether their data is shared. And maybe you want other entities like researchers to be able to get your data, but it should be your choice. We have an illusion of medical privacy, and until we educate people about the reality, no one will feel the need to fight for change. The most important thing that we can do is make people aware of what's going on, to shift culture away from complacency around surveillance and remind people why privacy is worth fighting for.
We consider privacy the foundation of freedom. And if you don't have privacy, you don't have freedom.
That means health freedom, the ability to make decisions that stay just between you and your doctor that others don't get to control.
That's how important privacy is, and people don't even understand that. But every tyrant knows it because that's why they set up surveillance systems.
We dive into the surveillance part of this in our next video, looking at electronic health records that share all the personal information typed into them with countless entities. In the meantime, if you found our research helpful, consider supporting our nonprofit with a monthly tax-deductible donation. Our aim is to teach people how they can empower themselves when it comes to reclaiming privacy in their lives. Visit nbtv.media/support if you want to help us in this mission. We are entirely funded by your support. And don't forget to check out our merch shop for cool t-shirts like this one that also support our channel. It's a sword going into a surveillance camera. It's really cool. I I like it.